QuickBooks Online 2021. Enter transaction for income deposit for online cash basis business with the help and use of bank feeds. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Online 2021. Here we are in our QuickBooks Online bank feed test file. In prior presentations, we set up the bank feeds, entering the transactions from the bank into the system. Now we're adding those transactions into the data to be included in the creation of the end product, the financial statements. If we go into the transactions tab, we got our information, which are in what I would call the bank feed limbo. I'm going to close up the hamburger up top. Scrolling down, we're now going to be considering some deposit type of activity. I'm going to hit the amount tab on the right hand side and sort by the deposits up top. So now we got the items that are going into the checking account, and when they go into the checking account, then we would be typically considering these items to be something that would be revenue, most likely. So that's going to be what we'll consider now. How can we enter this information into the system? To do that, let's open up our financial statements, balance sheet, and income statement. Go into the tab up top, right-clicking on it, duplicating that tab. We're going to do it again, right-click on that tab and duplicate again, so we can then open up the balance sheet and income statement. So I'm then going to go down to the reports on the left-hand side. We're going to be opening up first our income statement. So within the reports on the left-hand side, we go to the profit and loss, the P&L, the income statement, scrolling up top, doing the range change from 010120 to 123120, running that report, closing up the hamburger, holding control, scrolling up just a bit to that 125, next tab on over to the left, going back down to the reports on the left-hand side. Then we're going to be taking a look at the balance sheet, opening up the good old balance sheet report. Range change up top, 010120 to 123120. Run that report, and then we'll close up that hamburger. And so there we have our two reports. Now, when we're thinking about deposits, things that are going into the checking account, we're typically, hopefully, thinking that those increases are coming from the customer. So then you would think, hopefully, we have the checking account then increasing, the other side then going to the income line item on the income statement in some way, shape, or form. However, we could have deposits for other reasons as well. For example, the owner might be putting money into the business, or we might have a loan that's going into the business. Those are probably transactions that don't happen as often, but when they do happen, we want to make sure that we're recognizing those transactions so that we do not include them in income, but rather record them as loans or investments in the equity section if the owner is putting them in place. So keep that in mind. That's the first thing you want to be keeping in mind. You want to be saying, okay, if there's something other than revenue that's increasing the checking account, then I want to make sure that I pick that up and put it into its proper location. Main things that might do that, loans or the owner putting money in. Now, we're going to take a look at the float chart now, and we're going to do that on the QuickBooks desktop version. You don't need the desktop version in order to follow along. We're just going to be using the flow chart that's on the desktop version. So I'm going to maximize this item here, taking a look at the flow chart. We went over this a little bit more in the intro to the bank feeds, but now we're going to take a look at it real quick down here. We're down in the customers section because we're considering the revenue cycle. When we're considering the revenue cycle, there's a couple different ways, or it depends on the business as to how the bank feeds will fit into it, which again, we talked about a little bit more in the intro to this. We're going to first consider the easiest way that the bank feeds might be put into place, meaning we're not only going to be on a cash basis method, but we're going to be dependent on the bank in order to record our financial statements, in order to record our income. In other words, we're waiting until the deposits actually clear the bank before we record them in our system. That would be the easiest thing to do. So that's going to be our first method, and then we'll add basically levels of complexity to it after that point in time. The next level up in complexity would be something like you're collecting, say, money at the point in time that you make cash sales, possibly making then sales receipts at that point. Then even though you're on a cash basis, in essence, at that point in time, you still need to go to the bank and make deposits into the system, and you're probably going to be wanting to do a step away from being reliant on the bank statements in order to record the deposits, meaning you'll probably record the sales receipt here, and then you'll record the deposit, and then you'll match out the deposit to the bank feeds. And then if you have a full service type of system, meaning you might create an invoice so that you can track who owes you the money, then you're going to have to receive the payment and then record the deposits. We'll take a look more at those at a later point. when you're going to be dependent on the bank statement in order to record the income in the system, some of the easiest type of methods to do that, or the type of business that would be easy to do that with, would be things like online type of services like gig work or something like that. So if you were getting paid for services like at Audible or something like that, they're paying you for the books, or you're getting paid by YouTube AdSense revenue or something like that, or you're getting paid from Amazon, those kind of revenue, then once it comes through, you might just record it income at that point in time. You don't have to collect cash, for example, like you would in a restaurant or something like that. You don't have to create the invoice and then track the invoice and track the accounts receivable. So that's the kind of industry that we're first considering here, that this method, the easiest method, would work easiest or best in. Now, just remember, like if I look at the bank statement over here, and this bank statement, we're imagining coming from the bank, reflecting the bank statement, and this is not the data that we're going to put in our system, just a mock bank statement. But just remember what we're talking about with regards to the bank feeds. We just have what the bank knows, and all the bank knows is that we have an increase in terms of deposits and the amount of the increase and the date, or we have a decrease. And right now we're focused in on the increases. So, and it'll differ a little bit in terms of the type of transaction. So obviously, if you just record cash transactions, meaning you do business, you take the cash, and then you record it into the bank at the end of the day, then the bank doesn't know anything other than the date you've deposited it and the amount. So those are the two things you have. Now, if you use then a cash basis system and you depend on the bank, you wait, in other words, till it clears the bank before we record it in the system, then we can do that, but we're losing some information to do that, because all we have is the date that the transaction took place and the amount in our bookkeeping system. We don't have the customer information, for example, in that system, and we're not being able to double check our sales as easily that we entered during the day to the deposit that was made at the end of the day. So you can kind of do that, and you can make the financial statements, you can make the income statement and the balance sheet, but you're going to lose some information to some degree. Another kind of system is we might have electronic transfers. So if we're getting deposits from, for example, gig work, like by Amazon or YouTube or other platforms that are just paying us money, then because it's an e-transaction, it's an electronic transaction, then we probably have some of the description information, which is usually useful for us to know who the customer is. So in that kind of situation, which we'll see here, we have a little bit more data, and we might be able to add the customers as we enter it in that system. If we're getting paid by checks, then if we enter the individual checks individually, then we might have the information in our bank account for the checks, like we can go to the bank transaction feed, but usually you have to go to the bank feed in order to open the check to add the detail of who the customer is in that case. In other words, it wouldn't flow through electronically if you received physical checks that you then scanned in or deposited into the system. You might have the canceled check available to you but you usually have to go to the banking system to pick it up. It won't just come through on the bank feeds. So the easiest method to use this would be the electronic type of transfers where you're getting paid electronically. So that's going to be the method, and our assumption here, of course, will be that any deposit that we have then is going to be revenue. That's going to be our assumption. So that means that we're just going to deposit it into the system, increasing the checking account. The other side's going to go to revenue. If we have any deposit that is not revenue, we want to make sure that we note that those things could be money that came from us, the owner, or money like from a loan, for example. Okay, so knowing that, let's go back on over to our QuickBooks Online. First tab, we're going to go then down to our bank feeds. So we're looking at our deposit side of things, and you can kind of see what we're talking about here with the description. So if we have electronic transfers, then you're going to have you got the date and you got the description over here. Oftentimes this is going to give you some more detail that you would have. Now, if it's a transfer from something like a PayPal, then all I know is that it came from PayPal. QuickBooks Online could allow us to basically do bank feeds from PayPal as well, which we might check out. And that would mean that you can have two sides of it. You could see the transfer coming from one bank feed account, PayPal, the other here. You'd pick up the detail then from your PayPal account, which is a common thing to be using if you have, online type of, again, gig work type of activity. So then you could have, mobile deposits. These could be like a check or something like that, where again, notice you wouldn't have the information of the customer on the check, but you could probably go into your online checking and then find like a check, and then put the customer. But it's a little bit more work than an e-transaction. So if you have like a Google AdSense, for example, type of revenue, then you could you could then tie that out to the customer with the description. So notice again, within the description here, they give us that information, and you want to make sure that you hit the cog on the right hand side. And I want to show the descriptions. Make sure you're showing all the detailed description, and that'll help you to kind of sort out your description. If you're getting paid from something like a Stripe account, which is another kind of intermediary type account, then it might be a little bit more difficult to determine where it comes from, right? It might come from like your website or something like that. For a Stripe, that's similar to a PayPal type of thing. If you're getting paid from like an Audible or something like that, then again, it'll kind of show you. If you're getting paid from Amazon, then again, it'll kind of give you a help to show you what that is, and so on and so forth. Interest payments. So those are just some kind of examples of the payments that you could have. Now, when you start to group the payments, notice that if you do work somewhere like gig work or something like that, you might have more kind of income accounts that you would have than you would have in some other place. Meaning, normally on the income statement side of things, if I was to take a look at the income statement, I would want to have a limited amount of income statement accounts up top, and then have the more detail broken out by customer. Like I can break out with other reports like customer reports and whatnot. But if you're doing like gig work, you might want to break it out by basically adding the customers, basically who's paying you, kind of thing here. So you got your major grouping categories. So you might group like who pays you in Amazon, group your Amazon payments together in like an income type account or something like that, rather than just grouping it into one sales account and then searching it by Amazon at a later point. So that's kind of what we'll do here. We'll group these together. So for example, if I go in here and we'll take a look at an Amazon type of payment. Let's pick an Amazon payment and say, so I'm just going to pick this one, and I'm going to say, okay, there's big $3 payment here, and then I can add a vendor. Now note, Amazon is one where I have multiple different kind of payments here. Now if I know, like if you have any kind of thing where you know that these payments are a little bit different, like they're paying you for a little bit different things, then you could use one vendor like Amazon and then break it out to different categories with the use of rules. But sometimes it might actually be beneficial to set up a different vendor for each of the different things, so that you have a little bit more added detail when you sort by vendor, because then you can sort by vendor and it'll be a specific vendor. So even though it's all Amazon, I might make a different one for Amazon that I'm selling books versus Amazon versus other things that I'm selling, or maybe by location or something like that. So I'm gonna say this one, I'm gonna imagine this is for like Amazon Prime Video, just to put one here. So I'm gonna assume that these are like royalties for Amazon Prime Video. I'm just kind of making this up. So I'm gonna say Amazon Prime Video. So I'm gonna say Amazon Prime Video is gonna be the vendor, again, even though it's just Amazon up top, because I happen to know, I'm going to say I happen to know this is for the video, and I want to make a different vendor so that it'll make it easier when I populate things to tie it out to a different vendor as we go. So I'm going to say Amazon Prime Video tab, and then I'm going to make that a customer. So that's good. I'm just going to save it there. Now it's going to sales. I would like it to go to another income account. So I'm not going to just put it all to just the sales item. I'm going to add another income account and say that I want this going to then, let's say, an income account. It's going to be income, and I'm going to just call it other primary income, and I'm going to call it Amazon. Now, again, we might make it like one income account for all of Amazon, or I might make it a Prime Video income account. We might break out like our income from videos versus other types of incomes from multiple different vendors or something like that. So there's a lot of different kind of categorizations you can have here. I'm going to put it once again to Amazon Prime Video. And so that'll tie out, of course, to the vendor as well. Same name for the vendor and the name of the account. I'm going to save it and close it. So there we have it. Now, if we added a class, we can add a class here. I'm not going to get into classes here because we'll focus in on that separately. So I won't put a lot of time in on that. And then we've got the memo down below. And then again, we can create a rule related to this as well. Now I'm going to try to add a rule that will add some of these other payments. So let's imagine that I know that some of these other Amazon payments, although the name is slightly different, they're for Amazon Prime Video type of payments. And again, I'm just kind of making this up. Then I'm going to try to make a rule that will encompass this transaction for this item, as well as some of those other transactions, to try to automate this process in the future. So I'm going to say, okay, let's create a rule with it. Create the rule. I'm going to call it the Amazon Prime Video rule. So now, in order to make it more inclusive, I want to say, instead of all, I want to say any of these two rules. And I'm going to make it the description, so that the bank text, I'm going to make it the bank text again. I believe that was the one that was working better than the description. And I'm going to say it contains. Now, instead of having this whole thing in here, I'm going to try to break it down to the thing that will make it most descriptive of this particular transaction. So I might get rid of, say, all the numbers. And I'm going to say I don't need that. I would think that Amazon EDI might do it there. Maybe I get rid of even the payment and the numbers here. So I definitely get rid of the numbers. So I'm going to say, let's get rid of this. And so I don't need the payments. I'm going to say just the EDI. So there we have it. And then I'm going to add another rule that'll be a little bit more inclusive of some other transactions that will be similar. So I'm going to say this is going to be bank text again, contains. And this time I'm going to say Amazon Media EU, because we had that item in there as well. It was all capitalized. I don't think the caps matter, but Amazon Media EU. So there was another transaction. I believe anything with that description will also be, I'm going to say, grouped into our Amazon Prime Video account. So those are the two I'm going to pick up. I'm going to say save it and close it. Save it and close it. And so there we have it. So now if we scroll down, notice we got down here Amazon Media EU. That's a little bit different. It's got our rule. So the rule has been applied. So I can then check that out. So here's going to be that information. And we can say, okay, that looks good. And we can say confirm that one, let's say. So we got that transaction that we added basically with the rule. Here's the other Amazon. This is for the Media EU. And notice it didn't apply out to all the Amazon.company payments. And I would think it would apply out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check out the rule. I'm going to go to the rule up top again and say, okay, let's look at this Amazon Prime rule. I'm going to edit it. And this first one, because I skipped some text, I'm going to try to say, what if I just said Amazon.company and see if that picks it up. I'm going to save it and then go back to the banking tab and say, all right, that little adjustment. Let's see if we scroll down here to our Amazon items. So now we got Amazon.company. Now that's being picked up by the rule here. So let's just add one of those, Amazon.company. Let's add this one. I'll just add the one here. So that looks good. So I'll confirm that. And then let's just check it out and see what happens. So if I go then to the balance sheet, I'm going to bring it up to that 125, take out the checking account, take a look at the checking account, and then there we have our deposit, which we should have. Here's one deposit we want. And here's our two deposits down here. Big money coming in. So there we go. I'm gonna select one of those items. And it of course doesn't take us to the bank feed, but to a deposit form. So here's the deposit form that we basically created when we used the bank feeds. I'm gonna close this back out. And then let's go back to there it is. And then let's go back to the income statement tab. Let's refresh this, run the report. And then if I scroll down, now we've got this new category that we set up in the income, Amazon Prime Video. If I select that item, there's the two that we then chose that come in from the Amazon Prime Video. Scrolling back up top, we also added a customer. So if I right click on this tab and duplicate this tab, and let's just check out the customer that we added. Going to the sales tab on the left-hand side. And then we can go to the customers tab up top. And then we have our information for that particular customer. So there's Amazon Video. If I go into Amazon Video, then we should have the information related to them. Note here, although we have the customer in place and you do want to add the customer typically, we're still missing kind of some data here, because normally the transactions related to the customer would be, if I go back to the QuickBooks desktop just to see the flow chart, either an invoice or a sales receipt. And we went right to the deposit form. So QuickBooks, although we have the customer in there, doesn't usually use that form to basically track the information, because again, it would be recorded typically with a create sales receipt if we received it at the same point in time, or an invoice. So even though we were able to add the customer, we are still losing a little bit of data that we can then typically sort by, which is another reason why, if you go back to the income statement here, it might actually be useful under that method then to add a little bit more detail up top, such as like the customer name, in this case, the Amazon Prime as the customer name. Let's do another one. If I go back to the first tab, now we'll do Audible, and I'll keep these as not added now, and we'll add them probably later, just so we have some more information if we need other examples. So I'm going to go to Audible here and say, let's just go ahead and add Audible. I'll add the oldest one. And so we're assuming this is like a royalty payment, which again, is a perfect thing to just basically add to the system just with the use of the bank feeds, right? And so what we'll typically do is there's Audible Incorporated, so you could just copy this in the memo typically, put that in the vendor field. So I'm going to be picking up Audible vendor field. I'll just add that. I'm sorry, not a vendor. This is a customer field this time, because these are paying us. So if I got that terminology wrong, I apologize. This is a customer. And then I'm going to try to do the same thing for the category. So I'm going to call it another income account by who's paying us typically, because that kind of tells us what we're getting. I might call it, in this case, Audible would be audiobooks. So I might call it audiobook revenue. If I have different people that are paying me audiobook revenue, I might call it, different people. But if it's, all my audiobook revenue is from Audible, then maybe I just simply call it, the Audible revenue here. So I might then say add. I'm going to say this is going to be an income type of account. And this is going to be an other primary income. And again, I'm just going to call it Audible, not just .com, but just Audible. And again, you might want to call it something more generic in case you have other sales that are like on, audiobooks. So you might call it audiobooks instead of Audible or something like that. But I'll keep it at this. I'm going to say save and close. Then we could create a rule with it. So I'm going to go down and say I'm going to create a rule. And I'll call it Audible rule again. And so notice I'm copying and pasting that same thing from the description, customer, and in the rule. Same thing we did kind of with the vendor side of things. And then this time it doesn't really matter if all or any, because I'm just going to be choosing one item. So I want to be the bank text, because that seems to work best, as opposed to the description contains. And then I don't need anything other really than audible.inc. So even though they might all be the same here at the end of it, I really only need that. I want to get rid of the numbers and whatnot, because that might block, future transactions from being added. So the transaction type here, it's going to be Audible, and it's going to go to the category of Audible, which is an income account. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then that looks good. Let's check it out. So now we've got all these Audible items here that are being added with the rule. I'm just going to confirm one of them for now. So I'll confirm one, and then let's check it out. Let's go to the balance sheet. Let's refresh this thing, running it. So we have a fresh report, go into that. And then scrolling back down, we now have the Amazon, and we should have Audible in here. There it is. There's the Audible. Scrolling back up. And then we're going to get the income statement. And then let's say now we're going to go and refresh this report, running it. Now we have another income line item up top, Audible income. Scrolling into that item, there's the 71. If I go into that item, it's not going to go to the bank feed once again, but rather to the form that QuickBooks will then assign to it, which of course is an increase to the checking account. That's going to be the deposit type form. So we have the deposit form, closing that back out, scrolling back up, then back to the balance sheet. If we go to the customers, then we should have another customer name popping up here, even though we don't have as much on the detail of it. It's still really useful to have the customer names here, because when you do sort reports, if I wanted to sort a different report, then oftentimes I might be able to filter the report by the customer. So you want to add the customers to the transactions when you're adding them into the system. It just adds a little bit of data that might be useful if you need to sort the data in the future. So that's going to be that one. So let's do another one. I'll go back to the first one and say, let's say we got a Google revenue, so like a YouTube revenue or something like that. So now again, it's perfect because it's coming from an app, so we can just add that. I'm gonna say, all right, well, let's just add this one, and we'll call it. I'm gonna grab it from the name down here. I'll call it Google AdSense. That should be enough for the customer, and then I'll just save that. So I just copied and pasted it there. I'm gonna add another account. And I'm going to call it then the same thing. I'm going to add it, and I'm just going to call it Google AdSense. It's going to be a revenue account. So we might want to call it something more generic. Note, you might want to call it like, I don't know, platform revenue, but probably AdSense. AdSense revenue is probably a category in and of itself in that case. But you could categorize it with other similar revenue you might get from other, ad revenue or something like that. But I'll just call it that. We're going to say save it and close it. And so there we have it. So we've got our rule that we want to set up then. I'm setting up a rule for it. And I'm going to say this is, once again, I'm just pasting Google AdSense rule. It's going to be money in. It doesn't matter if it's all or any because I'm only going to have one transaction. I want to make it from the bank text that it contains. And then I just want Google AdSense. I don't really need anything else. Just Google AdSense. If it has that, it's probably revenue. It's money in. It says Google AdSense. That's where I want it to go. It's going to go to the AdSense revenue account. Looks good. So I'll save it. And there we have it. And now I'm just going to add one of them. I'll just add one. Let's add this one. So let's go ahead and confirm. Confirmed. Let's go back on over to the report balance sheet. Let's run it. And check out what we got in the checking. Check out the checking. And so now we've got Google. So there it is. And then if I go back on up top on the revenue side, into the revenue side of things, refreshing that report, we now have another income line item up top for the Google revenue. And that's got the $892 in it. And so if we go into that, there it is. And there's our deposit. Scrolling back up top, we also have our customer tab where we should have a new customer now, that being Google. So I'll go back to the first tab. Now we could use, of course, this rule to add all these other ones that are applying the rule out to it. We might do that later, but in case we need these other items for other transactions, I'll keep them not added yet. So let's add another one now. Let's say, now the other one, we have the Stripe income. Now Stripe is kind of like an intermediary, kind of like a PayPal that you might use to collect some revenue. You might have different areas that go through Stripe. So it gets a little bit more confusing for Stripe because sometimes it doesn't come in because it's a third party. It's not coming directly from the payer. It's going through Stripe, which is like a third party, kind of like a PayPal. But PayPal up top, you can actually use as a banking system, and you can actually get the information from PayPal to see the detail. So we might do that. We might do that later. Down here, we're just going to say, well, let's just add the Stripe item here, and let's just, if we know where it's coming from, we could just say if it's all coming from one source, like a website or something like that, we might just be able to add the website. If it's coming from multiple sources, then it might be a little bit more complicated. You might just call it Stripe income just to make sure you're adding it into income if you don't know exactly where it is, or you might be more specific. I'm going to say the vendor here. Let's say the vendor or customer. It should be customer. I keep saying vendor because vendor comes first and they're vendor/customer. Note, we don't really know who the customer is unless we go get the detail from Stripe until we get the transaction over there. So we're losing that information. I'm just going to call it Stripe as the customer. Stripe isn't who's paying us. They're the one that's facilitating the transaction. So once again, we're losing some data by doing this method, taking it directly from the bank. But, pros and cons. And then the category, I'm going to add a category for the income type account. And I'm going to say that this is going to be an income type of category once again. So it's going to be income, and we'll say other primary income. Now, if you don't know exactly where it's coming from, you might just call it Stripe income, just to make, because it might be coming from multiple sources. Maybe you don't want to dig up the multiple sources. You just want to make sure you're adding the income. If it all comes from one source, like a website sales or something like that, then you can safely assume, I'm going to assume it all comes from a website sales. I'm just making this up. So there's that. So I'm going to say save it and close it. And then, of course, we can make a rule on that. We could say, now I want a rule for the Stripe sales, and I'm going to call it Stripe sales, and then money in, doesn't matter, all or any. I'm going to make it coming from the bank text. So I'm going to hit the drop down here. want the bank text. We want it to contain, and then Stripe transactions. I don't want anything after the Stripe. All I really need is Stripe, right? Transaction, fine. That should be enough. I don't want any numbers or anything because that could mess it up. And then we've got there. That looks good. Let's go ahead and save it. So we'll save it. And now all the Stripe items should be coming through. I'm just going to add one this time. I'm going to confirm this one. All these other ones we might confirm, later. And then if I go back on over, we're going to say, okay, balance sheet. Let's go ahead and run it. Then, of course, we got in the checking account, we should see the Stripe. Let's go to the income statement because it's more interesting. Income statement, run it. And then now we've got the new website sales. Website sales in our category of income. If I go into that, we've got our Stripe sale that now has been pulled through. We have another customer that should be added who is Stripe, which again isn't an actual customer, but rather a third party, but that gives us a little bit more detail to track by. Now let's go back and do another one here. We're going to say, okay, let's say that let's pick up one of these items we have less. This one looks like it might be like a check or something like that, right? And I don't have as much detail. It just says it's a mobile deposit. So let's imagine we entered a check that we got paid. Someone paid us a check. Notice we have less detail here for this system. It's a little bit harder for me just to enter this directly into the system from the bank feeds because I don't have as much information on the memo line. So what you could do then, if that's your system, if you're getting checks in the mail rather than electronic transfers, is then go to the bank account online, pull up the canceled check to see who paid you so that you can then add the customer. And I'll just say this is Jones as the customer. I'm just making up. And I'm going to say save that customer. And then we want the category. Now, if you'd have to determine, obviously at this point in time, this would be more standard type of process where you build someone for work that was done or something like that. If you build them, you would have entered an invoice. That would get a little bit more complex. We'll talk about that later. But you're gonna have to assign the category. So it might just be sales. We might have another category. We might say I want to add a category here. Maybe it's income. And I'm going to say this is consulting or something like that. So other income, let's say it's consulting income. So we'll save it. And so there we have it. Now we can't really make a rule about it because once again, it's a check that got deposited and you don't have any information about the customer information or anything like that. We're just going to assume that any deposit in this format would be then revenue. And if you have a system where that's basically the case, then you might just include all deposits as revenue. And the easiest thing would be not to go online and add the customer, which means you'll lose a little bit more detail. Or you can go online and basically pick up the customer for every transaction, which will take a little bit more time to do. Meaning go online to your banking transactions, look up the canceled check, see who the customer is on the canceled check, add it to the transaction on the bank feed as we have done here. So we can then confirm it. And there we have it. So that should be added. If I go back to let's just go to the income statement and refresh the income statement. Now we have consulting income added. So we got the consulting income.